What if I told you there is one place Vladimir Putin fears losing more than anything else? Not Moscow, not Donbass, but Crimea. A single region that could change Russia's power, its navy, and the entire direction of the war. Today, we break down why Crimea is Russia's ultimate red line and why it matters more than you think. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into one of the most sensitive and dangerous topics of the Russia-Ukraine war, Crimea. For Moscow, Crimea is not just another occupied territory. It is a symbol of power, pride, and strategic survival. Since 2014, the Kremlin has treated Crimea as untouchable, repeatedly calling it a red line that must never be crossed. But why does this single peninsula matter so much compared to other battlefields? The answer lies in history, geography, and military reality. Crimea gives Russia direct control over the Black Sea, housing its most important naval base at Sevastopol. Losing it would weaken Russia's naval reach, reduce its regional influence, and damage Putin's image at home. For years, Russian state media has portrayed Crimea as permanently Russian, tying it closely to national identity. Any threat to that narrative creates political danger for the Kremlin. At the same time, Ukraine views Crimea as legally and historically its own territory, making it central to Kyiv's long-term goals. As the war evolves, Crimea has become more than land. It has become a psychological battlefield. The fear surrounding Crimea explains many of Russia's military decisions and red line warnings. Understanding this fear helps explain why the peninsula remains one of the most explosive flashpoints in modern geopolitics today. To understand why Crimea is Putin's biggest fear, we must look at how deeply it is connected to Russia's military strategy. Crimea acts as a massive forward operating base, allowing Russia to project power across southern Ukraine and the Black Sea region. From airfields to missile systems, the peninsula supports operations far beyond its borders. If Ukraine were ever able to seriously threaten Crimea, Russia would face immediate logistical and defensive problems. Supplies, troop movements, and naval operations would all become harder to protect. Beyond the military aspect, Crimea represents a political promise Putin made to the Russian people. The 2014 annexation was framed as a historic correction and boosted his popularity dramatically. Losing Crimea would damage that image and raise questions about leadership strength. That is why the Kremlin reacts so aggressively to any discussion of Ukrainian strikes near the peninsula. Even limited attacks trigger strong warnings because they challenge the idea that Crimea is safe. Internationally, Crimea also holds legal weight. Most of the world recognizes it as Ukrainian territory, meaning Russia's control is never fully secure. This combination of military vulnerability, political symbolism, and legal pressure turns Crimea into a constant source of anxiety for Moscow. When analysts talk about red lines, this is what they mean. Crimea is not just defended by weapons, but by fear of what losing it would represent. Crimea's importance also comes from geography, which makes it both powerful and vulnerable at the same time. The peninsula is connected to mainland Ukraine by narrow land corridors, making access routes easy to identify and difficult to defend under pressure. Over the years, Russia invested heavily in fortifications, air defenses, and logistics to secure Crimea, knowing its isolation could become a weakness. The Kerch Bridge, for example, is more than infrastructure. It is a lifeline linking Crimea directly to Russia. Any threat to this connection immediately raises alarm in Moscow. Ukraine understands this reality and has repeatedly stated that isolating Crimea could shift the balance of the war. Even discussions about targeting supply routes create strategic stress for Russian planners. Crimea also sits close to NATO-aligned countries around the Black Sea, increasing Russia's sense of encirclement. This proximity magnifies every military movement and intelligence report. For the Kremlin, defending Crimea is not just about holding territory, but about preventing a domino effect that could weaken its entire southern defense line. If Crimea becomes unstable, other occupied areas could follow. That fear drives Russia to allocate disproportionate resources to protect the peninsula. Geography makes Crimea a prize, but also a pressure point. In modern warfare, control of choke points and supply lines often matters more than sheer numbers. This is why Crimea remains central to Russia's defensive mindset and long-term planning. Another reason Crimea is considered a red line lies in domestic Russian politics. Vladimir Putin has carefully built his image as a leader who restores lost territory and protects Russian influence. Crimea became the strongest symbol of that narrative. State television, education, and public messaging consistently reinforced the idea that Crimea's return was historic and irreversible. If that belief is shaken, it could affect public trust in leadership. Authoritarian systems often rely on perceived strength, and Crimea represents that strength more clearly than any other region. Even small setbacks near the peninsula risk being amplified internally. This explains why Russian officials respond so sharply to any Ukrainian claims or operations involving Crimea. From Moscow's perspective, controlling the story is just as important as controlling the land. International pressure also plays a role. Sanctions imposed after the annexation of Crimea remain in place, reminding Russia that the issue is unresolved globally. Losing Crimea would not only be a military defeat, but a political humiliation on the world stage. It would signal that Russia could not defend its most prized gain. That possibility influences every negotiation, warning, and escalation threat coming from the Kremlin. When leaders talk about red lines, they are often protecting legitimacy as much as territory. Crimea sits at the intersection of power, pride, and perception, making it uniquely sensitive for Russia's leadership. From Ukraine's perspective, Crimea is not just a strategic objective. It is a symbol of sovereignty and international law. Kyiv has consistently stated that Crimea is Ukrainian territory, and that any lasting peace must include its return. This position is supported by most of the international community, which never recognized Russia's annexation. Because of this, Crimea carries diplomatic weight far beyond its size. When Ukraine speaks about Crimea, it is reinforcing a rules-based global order. Militarily, Ukraine understands that directly attacking the peninsula would be complex and risky. Instead, the strategy focuses on pressure, isolation, and long-term attrition, limiting supply routes, targeting military assets, and forcing Russia to spread its defenses thin. All serve this broader goal. Even symbolic actions can have outsized effects, shaking confidence and forcing Moscow to react. For Ukraine, Crimea represents leverage. The mere possibility of it becoming vulnerable changes negotiations and battlefield priorities. It also sends a message to allies that Ukraine is committed to restoring its full territorial integrity. At the same time, Kyiv must balance ambition with caution to avoid uncontrolled escalation. This careful approach explains why Crimea is discussed so frequently, but approached so strategically. The peninsula has become a long-term objective rather than a short-term gamble. Understanding Ukraine's position helps explain why Crimea remains central to the war's future, rather than its immediate present. International reactions further amplify why Crimea is such a sensitive issue. Western governments have repeatedly emphasized that Crimea is part of Ukraine under international law. This consensus limits Russia's ability to normalize its control over the peninsula. Every summit, sanction package, or diplomatic statement keeps the issue alive. For Moscow, this constant pressure reinforces the fear that Crimea will never truly be accepted as Russian territory. NATO's presence in the Black Sea region adds another layer of anxiety. Exercises, surveillance, and regional cooperation signal that the area is closely monitored. Even when no direct action is planned, perception matters. Russia must assume that any weakness could be exploited. This environment forces Moscow to invest heavily in defense rather than expansion. At the same time, global audiences watch Crimea as a test case. If borders changed by force are allowed to stand, it sets a dangerous precedent. That is why Crimea's status resonates far beyond Eastern Europe. For Putin, losing Crimea would mean losing a key argument used to justify resistance against Western pressure. It would undermine claims of strategic success and resilience. As a result, Crimea remains heavily fortified, politically protected, and rhetorically defended. The peninsula has become a symbol of confrontation between competing worldviews. This global dimension ensures that Crimea stays at the center of attention, regardless of shifting front lines elsewhere. Another critical factor behind Crimea's red line status is escalation risk. For Russia, Crimea is one of the few areas where escalation thresholds are deliberately left ambiguous. Russian officials often imply that extraordinary measures would be justified to defend the peninsula, without clearly defining what those measures might be. This strategic ambiguity is meant to deter adversaries by increasing uncertainty. From Moscow's perspective, if opponents believe Crimea is uniquely protected, they may hesitate to push too far. This approach shapes how the conflict is managed. Even analysts outside Russia recognize that actions involving Crimea carry higher stakes than operations elsewhere. This does not mean escalation is inevitable, but it does mean calculations become more cautious. Ukraine and its partners are aware of this sensitivity and often frame their actions carefully. Language, timing, and messaging are all adjusted to avoid misinterpretation. Crimea therefore acts as a stress test for crisis management on both sides. The peninsula forces decision-makers to weigh military advantage against broader consequences. For Putin, maintaining this delicate balance is essential. Any perceived loss of control could invite internal criticism or external pressure. By declaring Crimea a red line, Russia attempts to draw a boundary around its most valued asset. Whether that boundary is respected or tested remains uncertain, but its existence shapes every strategic conversation. Crimea is not just defended physically, it is defended psychologically through signaling and deterrence. Public perception outside the region also plays a role in why Crimea matters so much. Global audiences often view Crimea as the starting point of the current conflict, making it symbolic of the entire war. News coverage, documentaries, and policy debates frequently return to 2014 as a turning point. This framing reinforces Crimea's importance in the collective memory. For Russia, that attention is a double-edged sword. On one hand, holding Crimea demonstrates defiance against international pressure. On the other, it keeps Russia under constant scrutiny. Any development involving the peninsula quickly becomes headline news. This visibility increases reputational risk. For Ukraine, Crimea serves as a clear and understandable goal for international supporters. It simplifies a complex war into a recognizable issue of occupation and sovereignty. That clarity helps maintain diplomatic and public support abroad. As the conflict continues, narratives matter almost as much as territory. Crimea anchors those narratives for both sides. It represents injustice to one audience and restoration to another. These competing stories ensure that compromise is difficult. When symbols carry such weight, flexibility decreases. Leaders become constrained by expectations they helped create. Crimea's symbolic power, therefore, locks it into the center of global debate. This is why discussions about peace, security, and future borders almost always circle back to the peninsula. It remains the emotional core of the conflict in the public imagination. Looking ahead, Crimea's future will likely shape how this conflict is remembered. Wars are often defined by decisive locations, and Crimea has the potential to become that defining factor. Even if front lines elsewhere shift, the status of the peninsula will remain unresolved until a clear political outcome emerges. For Russia, maintaining control over Crimea is essential to preserving a sense of strategic continuity. For Ukraine, reclaiming it represents justice and restoration. This clash of visions means Crimea cannot be ignored or sidelined in any serious peace discussion. Analysts widely agree that any settlement leaving Crimea ambiguous would be unstable. That uncertainty could fuel future conflict rather than resolve it. This is why both sides continue to prepare for long-term competition over the peninsula. Military planning, diplomatic messaging, and alliance building all reflect this reality. Crimea forces global powers to confront difficult questions about borders, security, and international norms. It also highlights the limits of military force in resolving political disputes. Even the strongest defenses cannot erase legitimacy concerns. As time passes, the cost of holding or contesting Crimea continues to rise. Resources, attention, and credibility are constantly invested. This makes compromise harder, but also increases pressure to find lasting solutions. Crimea's role in the future will not just affect Ukraine and Russia, but the broader international system that depends on stability and clear rules. Ultimately, Crimea stands as Russia's ultimate red line because it combines strategy, symbolism, and survival into a single place. Few territories carry such concentrated meaning. For Vladimir Putin, Crimea is tied to legacy. It represents a moment when Russia appeared to reverse decline and assert itself on the world stage. Losing it would challenge that story and raise difficult questions at home and abroad. This explains why Moscow's rhetoric around Crimea is so firm and uncompromising. At the same time, Ukraine's determination ensures that the issue will not quietly fade away. As long as the peninsula remains contested, it will continue to influence military decisions and diplomatic relationships. Crimea reminds the world that modern conflicts are not only about firepower, but about narratives and legitimacy. Red lines exist because leaders believe crossing them would fundamentally change their position. Whether Crimea remains such a line in the future depends on evolving realities on the ground and in global politics. What is certain is that Crimea will remain central to any discussion about the war's end. Ignoring it would mean ignoring the core of the conflict itself. Understanding why Crimea matters so deeply helps explain not only this war, but how power and fear shape international behavior in the modern era. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video so more people can understand the real story behind Crimea. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more deep analysis on global conflicts and geopolitics.